The young man sat on the ground in the quiet corner of the park. His arms hung over his knees. His lank hair stood over his eyes. But even the bowed head and the long hair didn't quite hide the look of utter despair on his face. There were needle tracks up both arms, bruises and cuts on his boyish face, and it was obvious that this youngster had fought many battles in a few years. He had about him an aura of defeat, the look of one who had struggled against overwhelming odds and yet had failed to win out. Even the other homeless denizens of the park avoided being near him, as if his condition might be catching. One old man was curious, though, and he hung about even though he had a meal and a comfortable chair waiting at home. He sat on a bench nearby and watched the young man sitting and watching passers-by. And while they sat in this curious arrangement, the older man began to hear and notice the comments of those walking through. The other homeless men and women had their own problems, didn't want to be concerned with another one's problems, and they looked at him with a sort of morbid curiosity, but didn't seem to want to come too near. "Walking dead man" was the general expression among these people when they said anything at all. Then there were teenagers and young adults, those who have not lived long enough to learn either caution or compassion. And they laughed and made comments too rude and ugly to repeat. Some even threw pennies or half-eaten snacks. The young man made no sign that he even felt whatever hit him. He looked up occasionally with a beaten expression and watched the people pass by. The older man was struck by a few of the missiles meant for the other, and he slung them to the ground and glared the teenagers down. His efforts at intimidation were ignored, though. The teenagers only laughed and walked on. Then a group of businessmen and women walked by, obviously on their way to a quick lunch. They made no effort to hide their looks of disgust, and the old man thought he heard one of them say, "Scum of the city! Need to drown them all in the bay." And then, a hopeful sign. There came 3 members of the deacon board in the old man's church. Surely they would show some compassion. The old man looked up and smiled, but the other men were busy talking and never recognized their brother in Jesus. They did recognize the signs of a homeless drug addict, though, and the old man was surprised to see all 3 men deliberately cross to the far side of the path as they walked by. He heard them discussing the young men as if he couldn't possibly guess who they meant. One said, "It's a shame and a disgrace what some people do with the gifts God gave them." Another's comment was, "He's obviously under the judgment of God. Well, I pray for God to pour it on him even more until he straightens up." And the final comment as they passed out of earshot, "Thank God I was obedient. I would never have allowed myself to fall that far." There were tears in the old man's eyes. His heart was broken by the callous attitudes of his brothers, and ashamed to admit that he had at one time made statements much like that. But God had shown him something about this young man. God had shown him that underneath all the dirt and scars and despair was a heart that truly wanted to do better, and along with straight talk and accountability, he needed godly love and support. Evening was drawing near, but it wouldn't have mattered to the old man if the park had been full. He fell to his knees and used the wooden bench as an altar, repenting of his own hard-heartedness and asking for God for grace and wisdom in how he dealt with the unattractive members of his world. And as his tears soaked into the wood, he sensed the light and warmth around him and looked up in surprise. This young, defeated-looking man was gone, and in his place there stood a tall and beautiful angel, shining with the glory of God and looking down with approval on his face. He said, "God has sent me to teach you this lesson, Son of God. Your brothers and sisters need to remember that love should be their primary goal and motivation, and the beginning and the end of all they do and say. Now, go and teach others the lesson of love.